Hello, everybody, and good evening to you all. It is the evening of the 15th of September 2024, and we are coming to you today with a live stream on the always interesting issue of the Second World War and the mythology that surrounds it. Now, this has been inspired by the recent ravings, should we say, of a half-witted American fascist while speaking to another quarter-witted American fascist, that is, of course, a certain Daryl Cooper, an odious, stringy gimp, talking to CIA man Tucker Carlson, as Vladimir Putin observed once. And this prompted, of course, a storm of outrage because Cooper, who goes by the rather artsy, pretentious name Martyr Maid on Twitter, carried out what was essentially an act of large-scale historical revisionism that sought to question the conventional narratives around World War II, but from a fascist perspective. And I don't think I'm doing Cooper a disservice by calling him a fascist. Any man who publishes or puts out pictures of the Nazi high command strolling around conquered Paris and says, oh, this is preferable to the Olympic opening ceremony, not only has a problem in terms of a sense of proportion, but is clearly telling you who he is. So Cooper's a fascist, no point arguing about that. Carlson's pretty much a fascist. I mean, I've resisted saying that for a long time, but there's no doubt in my mind now that he belongs, in a family sense, to that group that operates within the American state machine that keeps alive, I would say, a tradition of American fascism, which isn't to say that, of course, the US is a fascist state. There is the same core of individuals within the ruling class and the state machine in all of the imperialist countries that is staffed by some extremely hardline reactionaries who, if not fascists, are very close to it, because, well, that's what it takes to staff these state institutions. The strongest supporters of imperialism, the strongest and most hardline elements that are anti-worker, that are absolutely chauvinistic, that are willing to do all kinds of heinous things in order to defend the system that is dependent upon private ownership of the means of production, well, those are generally fascists, and they generally come from, if not the bourgeoisie, then the very upper levels of the petty bourgeoisie. And that, as I said, that exists in Britain, that layer exists in France, it's in Germany, Italy, and it exists in the United States. That's the layer that Carlson originates from. And it's the layer that Cooper hopes to worm his way into, which is why he's doing fascist apologies on Tucker Carlson's program. However, unlike some, I will not come here and say that and defend the honour of Winston Spencer Churchill or any of the other individuals in the Allied camp that Cooper sought to question in his own way. Now, just because fascists like Daryl Cooper and Tucker Carlson by extension wants to question World War II from the perspective of their own pro-Third Reich sympathies, which are very prevalent in the upper crust of both Britain and the United States, and were even back then. We should remember that the biggest objections to the trials of senior German officers came from first the British senior officers and then also some of the Americans. Why? Because certainly in the case of the British, they knew very well, the British senior officers did, that the things that the German High Command had done and had ordered or had acquiesced to were very similar to things that they had done and would do again. So just from looking at that, looking at the fact that the Nuremberg trials were there because the Soviets insisted upon having them, and the US and the British and the French weren't in too much of a position to object. They were sort of trapped by the nature of the war that they had been forced to wage against fascism, against all of their instincts and their interests in many respects. But it was the Soviets who insisted upon the Nuremberg trials, because it was, of course, the Soviets who had suffered the greatest casualties and had the greatest horrors inflicted upon them by the Nazis. And so it was their insistence that an international trial had to be had. And it was their insistence that gave us the Nuremberg laws, which the Nuremberg precedents, I should say, which are cited by liberals favourably all the time, but they always forget to say why those precedents and why those judgments were reached. And it was at the insistence of the Soviet Union. You know, the same country that these same liberals will tell you was a horrible tyranny. Now, I prefer the likes of Daryl Cooper's fascist apologetics, because at least he's being absolutely open about who he is. The most dishonest interpretations of World War II, of course, some of them do come from fascists, but the most dishonest of all generally come from liberals of various different shades, who we'll come to in just a moment. So is it right and proper to question this most holy of wars in the West? Yes, it is, most certainly, because the image that we are given of it as children, when we grow up and we start learning about it, certainly this was true in my case, the image that we have of it is a cartoon. It is a cartoon informed by propaganda, starting with Churchill himself, who, as a prolific writer and as a wild egomaniac, sought to write the history of the war, which is, if nothing else, an entertaining read. He was an arsehole, but he was an entertaining writer, Churchill. Of course, his history of the war is littered with fictions and self-aggrandizing, but there you go. But the myths begin almost immediately, and the attempt to rewrite the history. So even things that Churchill admitted to in his own writing, such as that the Wehrmacht was defeated principally inside the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe by the Red Army. And even Churchill admits that. That fact has been steadily erased, and the British propagandists and the American propagandists have been assisted in the erasure of that history by the fact that the Soviet Union was destroyed in a counter-revolution. So when the country that beat the Nazis is dissolved and disappears, leaving only a pale shadow behind, the job of the propagandist gets much easier. But that was one of the principal things they wanted to do, which is to write out of the history any role played by not just the Soviet Union, but communists as a whole. So yes, it is entirely correct to question the history of World War II, to question the aims and objectives of the leaders of Britain and the United States, to question just why was it that France collapsed so quickly when its army was actually bigger at that stage than that of Nazi Germany itself. Why did the war start in 1939? How did the nature of the war change with the attack on the Soviet Union? What was the truth of the Winter War in Finland that the Soviet Union waged? What was the truth of the entry of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union in 1939? Because all of those things are either not talked about or they're systematically misrepresented. So the role of the Soviet Union in the war is systematically misrepresented by hack propagandists like Anthony Beevor, like Andrew Roberts. These are British historians, by the way, British bourgeois historians, like Max Hastings, like Simon Sharma, the TV historian, and there are many, many others who will either not mention the Soviet Union's role at all, or will mention it only in disparaging terms. I mean, Beevor just basically recites all of the accusations made against Stalin's role in World War II made by Khrushchev, which, of course, some of which come from earlier allegations made about Stalin by Trotsky. Of course, Trotsky died before the Operation Barbarossa was launched, but some of the hysterical lies that Trotsky told about Stalin and the Soviet leadership were repeated by Khrushchev, and of course the bourgeois historians pick those up and repeat them endlessly. So it is important to sift through the propaganda and find the reality. and not just repeat bourgeois narratives. Because, as my comrade Jyoti Brar pointed out in her recent discussion with Garland Nixon, which I would encourage you to all to watch, because World War II ended up not by the intentions of the imperialists, but by force of circumstance, being a war that was seen as progressive and was generally embraced by large sections of the working class as a noble cause. What ended up happening was that this cast a long shadow post-war World War II in terms of the image of the participating nations. It did the image of the British Empire, the power of good, particularly as the British Empire as a land empire started to disappear shortly afterwards. And so the British ruling class and the American ruling class have appropriated World War II for their own ends ever since. I mean, one of the points that Cooper made, which was true in that interview, was that every single adversary the US picks to go to war with after World War II is described as the new Hitler. This is true also of Britain. They described Gamal Abdel Nasser as the new Hitler. This was Anthony Eden's phrasing. They used to describe Saddam Hussein as the new Hitler. I mean, these are all insane comparisons, not only because of the fact that Nasser headed a progressive Arab socialist government, but also that you're comparing anti-colonial nationalists of varying degrees. I mean, if you've listened to this program for a while, you know I have many negative things to say about the Iraqi Baathists, but they were pro-Iraqi sovereignty and independence to a large degree. So to compare them to an imperialist power makes no sense. To compare Egypt or Syria or Iraq to 1930s Germany, even with the damage done to it, which was still one of the most industrialized nations in the world, it makes no sense. It's just naked, crude propaganda designed to justify imperialist wars by appealing to the one war in British history, which nearly everybody in the country agrees led to what is seen as a positive outcome. So again, it's quite where Cooper is right, is that they have hidden behind the victory of 1945 ever since then. But let's start off by looking at some of the other things that Cooper said. I mean, he says a lot of ludicrous things. He claims that Hitler didn't want war. I mean, again, though, he, as a fascist, does boil it down to the personality of Hitler. Now, he makes the claim that it was the British and Churchill and the evil communists that wanted the war. Well, I won't rehash what others have said in covering this. Hitler's own intentions are pretty clear in what he wrote. What I want to talk about is, of course, the actual role of Hitler. Who was he really? In terms of like a fascist like Cooper and others will proclaim that Hitler was some sort of misunderstood rebel. I mean, I refer to him constantly as the failed Austrian watercolor artist because that's an amusing explanation. But in reality, you look at like who Hitler was. The idea that he was ever a rebel against anything is patently false. I mean, what the source that I've used for some of the information I'm about to go through is the book Who Financed Hitler? The Secret Funding of Hitler's Rise to Power by James Poole and Suzanne Poole, which contains a lot of interesting historical details, including Hitler in his early years. Well, how does he get his start? Where does he come from? Other than, of course, he came ultimately from an Austrian family and spent a lot of his time in Vienna, spent some of his time in Bavaria, comes to join the German army in 1914, is stretchered out with shell shock and temporary blindness, which proved to be a psychosomatic illness. But after that, he almost immediately starts working for German military intelligence. After he's come back from the war and he's back in Germany, which is in the middle, of course, of the German Revolution of 1918, which comes close, were it not for the treachery of the Social Democrats, it would have come even closer to a successful revolution that destroyed German capitalism. Now, had they done that, had they overthrown the German capitalist class, then it's a fair assessment to make that military intervention by the Entente powers against a socialist revolution in Germany would have been near impossible, given it could have been potentially aided by the new USSR, that it would have rallied a demoralized people behind it, as the USSR did, and in the move to push for a new and socialist Germany. And also the spread of a socialist revolution to Germany would have immediately caused trouble in France amongst the working class and Italy. A successful revolution in Germany would have ended the discussion around World War II, because it wouldn't have happened. But that's a digression. So let's go back to the personage of Hitler. Cooper, like many fascists, claims that this great man, this man who just wanted to revive Germany and paint watercolors, is misunderstood. Well, in a way, like the thing with fascists, you find is that a lot of what they say is like a hall of mirrors. It's like to take as the example, like the anti-Semitism bullshit of the Nazis. Like, that was used as a stand-in for class struggle. It was used to distract and divert the angry petty bourgeois base that the Nazis built up and keep them running after the Jews as the villain, the Jewish bankers, rather than the German capitalist class. I'll come to an example of that in just a moment. But Hitler, from the beginning, is a creation. He's a creation of the German ruling class themselves. And in a very direct way, because he was working for German military intelligence. That's why he goes to the original meetings when, before it was called the NSDAP, National Socialist German Workers' Party, when it was just called the German Workers' Party. The reason why he goes to its meetings is because he's sent there by German military intelligence. And he's sent there to spy on it and also to participate in it. If this is sounding familiar, this is what the American government does with the right-wing militia movement, and this is what the British government did and continues to do, more than likely, with the loyalist paramilitaries in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland. So Hitler is on a mission from from elements within the German state, German military intelligence more specifically. And he goes to this party, which is called the German Workers' Party, which is funded and founded by aristocrats in Bavaria. Why? Because at the time, 1918 to 19, the idea of revolution is gripping the entire working class. The Social Democrats are working directly with the most reactionary elements in the German ruling class to divert and destroy this. Part of the efforts of the German ruling class is that they set up fake socialist organizations like the German Workers' Party, with the idea being that they could divert workers into this purportedly socialist organization that would in reality be a bourgeois organization run by them. The bourgeoisie have always been willing, doesn't matter whether it's Germany, Britain, America, to put on the clothing, to wear the clothing of socialism if they need to. If they need to do that to survive, they will, as long as it's a party that they can completely control and is anti-revolutionary and anti-Marxist, as the thing that became the Nazis always was. So from the very beginning, it's set up on a deception. And Hitler comes into the leadership of it as being, and he's sponsored, again, from the very beginning, by German military intelligence and a circle of rich aristocrats and bourgeois in Bavaria. And from this, of course, he goes on to meet people like Ludendorff, who was not by no means a rich man, but was a very well-connected one. And Hitler builds his connections amongst the bourgeois of Bavaria and wider Germany all the way through the 1920s. And he even, of course, gets a fan base from his fellow fascist Mussolini in Italy and his fellow anti-Semite, a certain Henry Ford of Illinois, USA, who did fund the Nazis directly, as did a lot of European, British, and American bourgeois, Ford being the foremost amongst them. But they were all involved in funding the Nazis and getting them set up. But my point here is that Hitler was an agent of the German state from the very beginning, was a pet project of the certain ultra-reactionary elements within the German bourgeois from the very beginning, and showed himself for what he was very quickly when the issue of the redistribution of the landed estates came up, the estates that had been confiscated from the royal families of Germany who had been thrown out of power. See, remember that each German state used to be a kingdom. So it used to be the Kingdom of Bavaria within the wider German Empire. And when the royals were deposed, a lot of their estates fell, well, open for redistribution. The Nazis led a vigorous campaign in defense or against the redistribution of the land on the grounds that it was a Jewish plot. See, whenever the issue of class struggle intensified, the Nazis were there, very well funded at various different points. They ran out of money periodically when they ran into trouble in the 20s, but there was always a German bourgeois or 10 who would step forward with more money or a line of credit. The Nazis, when the issue of redistributing the land of the former aristocrats came up, claimed the whole thing was a Jewish plot. Again, they do this every time the class struggle intensifies. Why? Because, again, to use a phrase that is sometimes attributed to Engels, sometimes attributed to August Bebel, sometimes attributed to another politician in, I believe it was Austria, anti-Semitism being the socialism of fools. Well, that's exactly what the Nazis were set up to do. To every time the class struggle started to intensify, you bring out the Nazis, the ruling class would, to muddy the waters by claiming the whole thing's a Jewish plot. The Jews control both the bankers and the communists. They've got you coming and going, you know. So it just so in order to sow as much confusion and division within not just the working class, but also to make sure that the petty bourgeoisie remained on side, which is, of course, they become the principal base of the Nazis. But this is why the bourgeois fund, racists. I mean, the methodology used by the bourgeois hasn't changed in over 100 years. I mean, what do you think the arrangement that Stephen Yaxley Lennon is, that he has with the British government? Periodically he'll go spend a short amount of time in prison, then he'll be out again, he'll be broke periodically, then he'll come into a load of money from some donor or another. This is how the ruling class keeps the fascists dangling on a string. You wheel them out, you let them do their agitational work. When they've done what they need to do, when you've achieved your objectives as an intelligence service, you pull them back again and have them go to go to prison, have them lie low for a while, then you bring them back in again when you need them again. That's the arrangement that the bourgeoisie has with fascists. So the point I'm making in going into this digression is that to see Hitler, as I'm sure Daryl Cooper does, as some sort of great romantic rebel is a giant stack of bullshit. Hitler was, from the very earliest days, a creation of the German ruling class, as all fascists are. It doesn't matter if it's Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, Oswald Mosley. Help that Oswald Mosley was, of course, directly from the British ruling class himself. But they are always either from the ruling class or direct employees of the ruling class. And Hitler always was an employee of the German ruling class to the bitter fucking end. And we'll come to the bitter fucking end in just a moment. And that's the reality of the origins of the Nazis. They weren't rebels. They were bitter reactionaries employed by the ruling class to use paramilitary tactics, terror tactics, to stop the German Revolution in its tracks. And in this, of course, they were joined by the treacherous leaders of the German social democracy, Friedrich Ebert, Gustav Nosk, Philipp Scheidmann, and others, who, of course, are idols to social democrats to this day. So when we say that, following Stalin, that social democracy is objectively the moderate wing of fascism, this is what we mean. Part of what we mean, anyway. So, first part of the mythology that Cooper believes in, which is Hitler as the rebel who just wanted to restore Germany, that, of course, is all bullshit. Let's get to the other idea, the idea that Hitler didn't want war or wanted a limited war or only wanted to restore German pride. Again, forget looking at Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf's a stream of consciousness load of old drivel, which you should read if you've got time or you're a scholar, but it's not particularly necessary. Though I will say one thing, though. Hitler would have done some epic threads on Twitter, because having read the long threads by avowed fascist apologists like Cooper on Twitter, that's what Mein Kampf reads like. It's like a series of ranting, raving tweets that is designed to appeal to the rather perverse sensibilities of the German ruling class. Now, if we move on to like other pieces of mythology, which is to address Cooper's points about where Hitler's intentions. Well, forget Hitler's intentions. Let's talk about German imperialism's intentions, of which Hitler became the man at the top of from 1933 onwards. So why does German imperialism go back to war? Because principally World War II in its origins is a continuation of World War One. And the unfinished business from World War One is the fact that the British and the French, with the United States behind them, knocked down German imperialism, but didn't knock it out, didn't finish it off. Now, German imperialism, to recap for those who are unfamiliar, it gets involved in World War One. Why? Because Germany unifies later, far later than Britain, far later than France. Comes into its unified state only fully after 1871, and the Franco-Prussian War. And because it's late to the party, it makes great strides in developing industrial capitalism, but it's late, which means when Britain and France have moved into the imperialist phase, which of course is a phase of degeneration, but increased export of capital to the colonies, and the need for more colonies as a result, Germany is late to that. So whereas you look at a map of the colonized world in 1895 to 99, 1895, 99, that period, where the world's been divided up. And you can see the vast swaths of Africa that are coloured pink, that are occupied by the British. So almost all of the western parts of Africa, so like Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, the Tanzania as it is now, or I think it was called Tanganyika back then, was of course occupied by the Germans. But you skip over that and you go down to like you go to places like Uganda, go through there, you then hit places like Zimbabwe, and at a certain point after World War One, you could walk in a direct line from Alexandria in the far north down to Cape Town in the south, and you could walk only through British colonies. That's how big the colonial occupation was in Africa by the British. Same with the French on the west coast, British on the east coast. French West Africa is this giant area now covered by the countries of the Sahel. You also have Morocco, Algeria, etc. Germany has Cameroon, it has Tanganyika, has a couple of other places in Africa that are quite small. It has, of course, Papua New Guinea over in the far east, and some isolated islands and concessions in China. Not that big, not enough to satisfy the needs of German imperialism, which is why German imperialism stuck in terms of its need to expand, because Germany is truly rapidly going into the imperialist phase, necessitating greater export of capital and the finding of sources of labor that were hyper exploitable, which is what is key part of the basis of imperialism. It couldn't go into Africa any further without going to war with the British. It couldn't go further into Southeast Asia again without hitting the interests of the British and the French. And South America was contested area at the time between Britain, France, and the increasing imperialist power of the United States. So where can Germany go? Where can German imperialism go in 1914? East is the answer. Principally, Ukraine. Ukraine was a key objective of the German war drive, and at the time the Austro-Hungarian war drive, that the Austro-Hungarians were woefully inept on every single conceivable level, and so couldn't sustain their war and were losing badly against even the armies of Tsarist Russia. But the German aim was for Ukraine and for certain areas within old Tsarist Russia. That ultimately almost succeeds, but of course things fall apart on the home front, largely thanks to the inspiration provided by the Bolshevik Revolution and the increasingly desperate situation Germany found itself in due to the British blockade. Of all the things the British did in World War One, it was the successful naval blockade of the Germans that was probably the most effective. Certainly the stuff they did on the battlefield wasn't very effective for a very long time. But the point I'm making by going into this digression about World War One is the fact that World War Two is its direct sequel, because the issues confronting the German ruling class hadn't changed. They needed to find a vast area that they could hyper-exploit. And again, they couldn't find it in Africa. They couldn't find it in Asia. India was, of course, at the time under the exclusive control of the British. So the French and the Portuguese had some concessions there as well. So where can you go? The answer is, of course, Ukraine, funnily enough. And they tried this in World War One, didn't work. They do the same thing in World War Two. Now, admittedly, the story in World War Two is a little different, because the Nazis knocked out the French. Again, we'll come to that in just a moment, and isolated the British. And the Nazis genuinely thought that the British would come to terms with them. More on that in just a moment. But the reason why they turned east was because this was the long-standing desire of the German ruling class. Yes, Hitler dressed it up in a lot of bullshit about Lebensraum and stuff like that. But fundamentally, what is the need of both the German Empire and the Nazis in the 1940s? It's the occupation of all of Ukraine, Western Russia, and the reduction of the population there to slave status, and the hyper-exploitation of the land and the resources. And the fact that, of course, the Soviet Union was the world's first socialist state, a workers' state, that was having great successes in industrialization, that increased the ferocity of the German ruling class's attack on the Soviet Union, the need to extirpate communism, the need to destroy the center of world revolution. As Stalin observed in the 1930s, if the USSR is destroyed, then it will set the proletariat of the world back for a generation. And again, he said it would be a generation of the blackest reaction. Turned out he was right. It just came 60 years after he made those comments in the early 1990s with the counter-revolution in the USSR. Did set in many decades, a generation, in fact, of the blackest reaction. But the ferocity of the attack on the Soviet Union is partially explained by that need to crush the center of world revolution. But there's an even bigger need, which is the same one that animated the German ruling class in 1914, which is to conquer an area of comparable size and exploitability to that which the British had in the form of India. And this is the reason why Hitler is obsessed with the British in India. Why apparently one of his favourite films in the 1930s was the story of heroic British officer types suppressing the natives in India. Because he saw, again, he didn't come up with this idea. This is an idea that comes from the German ruling class themselves, that they would be able to suppress Western Russia and Ukraine, turn the population into slaves, have a small comprador clique of Russian and Ukrainian fascists that would rule over this partially for them, but then the area would be essentially the undesirables would be reduced to slave status, or they would be driven out into the Russian Far East, which would be sort of run as like a comprador regime run by Russian fascists on behalf of the Third Reich. And that all of the Western Russia, all the way down to the Caucasus, would be occupied and settled by the Germanic peoples. Same fate that they had in store for Poland, by the way. That's why they killed so many Poles. I mean, the Holocaust in the East, of course, was especially devastating. But one of the reasons why the death toll in the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and Poland is so high is because partly because of Nazi racial theories, but those racial theories themselves, again, these things all have material origins. Nazi racial theory, well, just the same as the racial theories that the British ruling class were so enamored with in the late 19th century, it has a material root. It's not just that the German ruling class were crazy, even though some of the beliefs certainly were, or that the British ruling class are especially psychotic, even though they are. It's that racism has a material root. And what is that material root? It's a need the ruling class has to come up with ideological justifications for enslaving brutalizing and destroying whole populations. That's what scientific racism is there to do, to justify that. And this is where Hitler's batshit crazy racial theories come from. It's from the bourgeois pre-existing bourgeois ideology in Germany. Remember, the German ruling class had already done their own Holocaust in Namibia prior to World War One, where they killed up to 1 million native Namibians. So Hitler didn't invent this. Hitler didn't invent mass murder or working people to death or trying to reintroduce slavery. All these things had been done already by the British, by the French, by the Germans themselves, certainly by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and the Italians in Libya and Abyssinia. So again, like the idea, and again, this is where it is entirely right to question the Western narratives about World War II. Hitler did not invent any of the things that he did. It was just a more savage, more brutal version, a more industrialized version, so we say, of things that had already been done. And the distinctions made in like the British bourgeois history are quite telling, really. So you'll get like an Anthony Beevor or an Andrew Roberts or a Max Hastings. You can Google the works of all of these people if you'd care to. I wouldn't bother myself. It all amounts to roughly the same thing. Peter Hitchens wrote a book that was a little bit different because he basically, his fascist apologetics took the form of him saying, well, Stalin was even worse than Hitler. Nothing like a Trotskyite to make that argument. But the point is that the distinctions drawn by the British ruling class and their historians about trying to draw lines between themselves and the Nazis, it's very difficult for them to do. So what they often end up doing is coming up with arguments about intentions. Like, well, the British, the difference between us and Hitler was, Hitler, he had people gassed and shot. That's horrible. We just starved them to death. That's much better. I mean, I'm laughing because you can't do anything else other than laugh. It's that ridiculous, the way the justifications they have for themselves. Because when you look at the obvious murderous criminality of the Nazis, killing tens of millions of Soviets and Poles and Jews of various nationalities, and not to mention the Roma people, people with disabilities, and all the other political and social dissenters in Germany itself. Of course, that's a massive level of industrialized mass murder and horror. But I've always been curious as to how it is that the British starving at least 4 million Indians to death in Bengal in the early 1940s, how is that any better? If we're talking morals here, how is starving 4 million people in Bengal to death in 1941-42, how is that better than the Nazis shooting people or gassing people or chopping people's heads off? Because the effect is the same, and it's coming from the same place. The ferocity of the Nazis, to make the point again, in the occupied Soviet Union, comes partly from rabid anti-communism, but also from an attempt to slaughter the native population if they wouldn't agree to be slaves. And the ferocity of that comes from the desperation of German imperialism. The reason why the war starts in 1939 is because German imperialism hasn't managed to get out of its crisis. The Nazis' economic policies designed for them by Hjalmar Schacht, who survived the war and was largely exonerated in the trials afterwards. Quite how he got away with that, I'm not sure. But the policies of Schacht and the German government under Hitler's stewardship had restored a certain degree of profitability via flattening the organizations of the German working class and basically introducing militarist discipline inside the workshops, inside the factories. That could only take them so far, though, as could the absorption of Czechoslovakia and Austria and even Poland. To actually fully restore German imperialism, to get out of the crisis that they were in, took gigantic amounts of conquest, which is why the conquest in the East is so savage. It's because the German ruling class have a need to get themselves out of the hole that they'd been in since 1918. And whilst Hitler had addressed some of these problems via his internal repressions against the working class and his easy conquests of Austria and Czechoslovakia, they needed more. They needed Poland. They needed the Western Soviet Union. And they needed it quickly. And they needed to reduce the population to abject slavery very quickly. And they needed to stamp out communism. And all of these things are things that the German ruling class needs to do. And they need to do them very quickly, whilst fighting a war and trying to knock the British and the French out of the war. And this is the basis for the savagery, the brutality, and the mass murder. It's the needs of German imperialism, just as it was the need of British imperialism to starve all those millions of Indians to death. Not just in 1941, but you go back into the later 19th century in India. There's something like at least 5 famines across the course of like the last 10 to 15 years in British occupied India. Like, talking millions and millions died by starvation, whilst the British all the time continued to export food from India into the world market. Again, let's ask the question, how is that any better than what the Nazis did? Now, the distinction that, say, a Simon Schama would draw would be, well, that's appalling. How dare you say that? We didn't mean to kill anybody. Like, we didn't, put a gun to anybody's head, even though that's not actually true. They put a gun to plenty of people's heads in India and in Ireland as well. We've talked about the Irish famine of the 1840s before, but again, ask yourself the question: how is it the case that the British ruling class gets to claim any moral superiority to the Germans, to the Nazis, because they used the weapon of starvation rather than the bullet? Even though they were, of course, very perfectly willing to use the bullet when they felt they needed to. But it's a curious question, and one that can't fully be answered. What the bourgeois historians generally do is hide behind denials. Oh, it's a bad year, crop failure. Never mind. Just don't pay attention to the fact that Churchill's only question was, has Gandhi died yet? Those of us who read communist histories of the Indian independence movement will, of course, laugh at the idea that Gandhi was the big enemy of British imperialism. He frequently collaborated with it. But to return to the point, all of these issues about what really motivated German imperialism are not covered in conventional bourgeois history in Britain or the United States. Nor, of course, is the true nature of the resistance to the Nazis in Europe covered. So, for instance, there was a communist underground in Germany all the way through, from 33 to 45, often operating as underground guerrilla organizations, often operating as in sort of spy and intelligence gathering roles, taking great personal risks, and many of them ended up either dead or brutally tortured, or one followed by the other. And so that's never covered. The German communist resistance to the Nazis, which was high profile, consisted of quite a lot of people and ran all the way up to 1945. That's never covered. The fact that the only really reliable fighters against the Nazis in all of the European countries were the communists is never covered. For instance, if you read about the French resistance, yes, there was de Gaulle, yes, there were certain bourgeois and petty bourgeois elements, but the leading organizing force in the French resistance was the French Communist Party. Just let's track back for a moment and think about, well, why was that? Well, because the bourgeois system collapsed in France in March 1940. What happened with the invasion of the Nazis wasn't a great feat of military genius on behalf of Hitler or von Rundstedt or Guderian or anybody else. Yes, they used some innovative tactics, but the real reason why they won, and won so quickly, was because they were allowed to. That's the truth. The reason why they conquered France so quickly wasn't a case as it was with Poland. The Polish army never stood much of a chance. The French army was much bigger than the German army all the way through the 30s. They had more tanks. I'm not sure about the relative strength of the air forces. I'd have to check that. But their defences were in certain areas very strong. And they, of course, had over 6 months between the outbreak of World War II. So they had October, November, December 1939, January and February, 5 months, to do some counter move to stop the Nazi build-up that was clearly happening around the borders of Belgium and the Netherlands. They could have launched some sort of attack into Germany itself in 1939. In fact, if you read the, I think it's the memoirs of von Manstein, when he's talking about his fears as a German military senior officer with the invasion of Poland, he said, well, our biggest fear was that if the French and the British launched a combined attack on our western flank, then we wouldn't have enough men to turn back and face them. So it does raise the question, why not? Why didn't they do anything? They were supposed to be Poland's ally, after all. The war was supposedly about defending Poland, and yet the British and the French make no effort to defend Poland, even when the Poles are still in the fight. Why not? Because, again, we'll get to their motivations in just a moment, but they make no effort to do so. They make one incursion, the French do, into one German village, I believe in late 39, and then they go home again. So why not? Well, here we come to another crucial point. What were the motivations of the British and the French ruling classes in all through the 1930s? Why did they turn down every single offer that the Soviet leadership made between 1933 and 1939 to form some kind of anti-German military alliance that would be specifically designed to stop Hitler's promised war drive? Well, we've covered this many times before, so I will only summarize here. It is because they wanted the Nazis to succeed in terms of going east, in terms of in their invasion of the Soviet Union. This is what the British wanted. The British ruling class, reason why that so many of them were keen on Hitler and in fact helped fund Hitler in the 20s and the 30s, was that they wanted the Nazis to go east to either destroy the Soviet Union or weaken it to the point where the British could step in and finish it off. And if the Germans beat the Soviet Union, the British hoped that they would be so damaged that the British would be able to either force them into a disadvantageous long-term agreement, or, if necessary, finish them off quite quickly. And so, as always with the British ruling class, look for the most cynical, the most diabolical aim you can possibly think of, and that's what they're aiming for. Bear that in mind when you're looking at Ukraine today. They haven't changed. They've got weaker, but they haven't changed. So the aim was to have the Nazis get to take themselves east and destroy the USSR. That was the aim of the British and the French. That's why they strung the USSR along with endless negotiations in the 30s, right up to 1939. And if in the final round of negotiations in 1939, the British sent a delegation headed by a junior military officer who had no power to sign anything or negotiate anything. That shows you how serious they were. They weren't. Their aim was to string the USSR along, also keep the Germans happy by giving them Czechoslovakia, by letting them have Austria. This is why they gave them Czechoslovakia. Never believe for a moment this bullshit that comes from British historians, British bourgeois historians, about why the British ruling class didn't want a war in 1939. You hear this endlessly from like these fucking apologetics for not just Chamberlain, but for the apologists for the British ruling class in general, saying, oh, well, they were haunted by the memory of 1914. They didn't want to see the slaughter of British youth again. Bullshit. These people wouldn't care, and they wouldn't bat an eyelid if they thought that they could get away with sending tens of millions of working class Britons to their deaths, and that if they could do it with no consequence, they would do. What they hated about 1914 to 18 was two things. Firstly, that it gave rise to the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917, and that revolution succeeded. That's the biggest thing that they regretted from the First World War. The second thing they regretted was the fact that they beggared themselves to the United States in pursuing that war. Those were the two things they actually regretted. And they knew that if they tried to send millions of working class Britons off to a similarly brutal and blatantly imperialist war, that it wouldn't be something that they could get away with, that they would be subject to an internal rebellion which they feared would go communist very quickly, precisely because of the influence of the legacies of the October Revolution and the influence of the USSR. So that's what the British ruling class really didn't want. The reason why they didn't want a war was nothing to do with the fact that they regretted millions of workers dying in 1914 to 18. They didn't give a fuck. These are the most cold-blooded people you could ever possibly imagine. That what they feared was the instability that would come from a new war. That's what they feared, which is why they gave Hitler Czechoslovakia. Because the idea was, well, and they cooked this up with the French, that, well, if we give Czechoslovakia to Hitler, if we let him have Austria, then he will be encouraged to head east. And what pulls the rug out from under that is precisely the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is signed after it becomes strikingly obvious to the Soviet leadership that the British have no intention of signing anything. And so the Soviet leaders worked out that, well, we know, and Stalin said this over and over again, that Hitler intends to invade, so let's try and buy a couple of more years to finish off more industrialization, finish our military reforms, etc. Get ourselves in as good a position as we can for the war that we know is coming, which is, of course, why they sign it. And this is reason why British historians in particular freak out about this to this day. It's nothing to do with moral disgust at signing a treaty with Hitler. They'd signed loads of treaties with Hitler. They complain about Stalin and the Soviet leaders signing a neutrality treaty, a non-aggression pact with the Nazis. They'd given Hitler Czechoslovakia. I mean, this is the thing. The British bitch and moan about that, but they moan about it because their plan didn't work. The plan was, well, hopefully, when Hitler heads east, then he'll go straight through Poland and he'll head straight for the Soviet Union. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, a slightly different history. Imagine there was no Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Imagine that the invasion of Poland steamrolls straight into the Soviet Union. Imagine that, if you will. Now, if that was the case, would the British and the French have gone to war? No. I don't think they would. I think they would have sat back, wrung their hands and said, great. And because this is what they were doing with the Winter War, which, by the way, was provoked by Finnish fascists who were pro-Nazi and continued to fight alongside the Nazis to the bitter fucking end. And when it came to the Winter War, the British were aiding the Finnish fascists in attacking the Soviet Union. And had the Germans not had their own game being played, which necessitated, from their point of view, reaching a temporary agreement with the USSR. Because, again, in the hierarchy of German imperialism, there was a split. There was those who wanted to go east right away, and there were those, I think particularly in some of the aspects of the German military, who wanted to settle a score with the French. That was, I mean, the Germans had no real ambition to rule France, not really. I mean, they occupied some of it, but they were happy to let Pétain rule most of it for them. But there were some in the German hierarchy who saw that they needed and wanted to knock the French out of the war, and they did that quite successfully. Had the opposite side prevailed, and had they just rolled straight east and never signed a non-aggression pact with the USSR, the British and the French would have got their objectives. So in the rage over the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is rage over the fact that the manoeuvres of the British were sussed out by the Soviet leadership, and the Soviets outmaneuvered them to the point where the Germans came west and the French collapsed. And now we'll get to the French collapse, as promised earlier. The French collapse, and I was brought up because I grew up in the early 80s, so my grandfathers were still alive at the time. The joke from that generation was always about how the French, surrendered quickly and they're all cowards and all that kind of shit. Of course, it's a popular piece of mythology that the British ruling class likes to spread around. But let's look at the reality of what actually happened in March of 1940. The reason why everything collapsed was because a huge section of the French hierarchy, like the French ruling class, French bourgeoisie themselves, the French political system, the French military, and all of the state forces had been, for most of the 1930s, pro-fascist or directly fascist themselves. And they had no desire to fight a war with the Germans. The war they wanted to fight was against their own working class. And the reason why they actively undermined the defense of their own country was because this pro-fascist section in France, remember we talked about the deep pro-fascist tendencies of the ruling class at the beginning of the episode. Well, in a moment of crisis, in a moment of intense class conflict, which is what you had in France all the way through the 1930s, the fascist forces made their play in March of 1940. And they undermined the defense of France by disorganizing the military, appointing aged pro-fascist incompetents to be in charge of the French military. And they were happy to see the French military collapse because that gave them the justification to carry out a coup, which is what they did. They carried out a coup in March of 1940. They capitulated to the Nazis and they installed Pétain as the fascist figurehead in what was called the Vichy regime. Happily turned over half the country for occupation by the Nazis, the strategically important part of it, so all the coasts, most of the coasts of the north and the west of France were under German occupation. Paris was under German occupation. And this is what the pro-fascist element in the French bourgeoisie, which I would argue is probably most of it, or certainly the strongest part of it, was willing to do to, as they would see it, crush communism in France. So what happened in France in March of 1940 is not just a military defeat. It was a military defeat that was created by an internal coup in France itself. So that's, with all the, I mean, this is talked about a little bit, even in bourgeois histories, that France was divided, France was demoralized, but they don't say what actually went on a lot of the time, which was a pro-fascist coup. The fascists in France had tried to stage a coup on a few occasions beforehand, but it had always been turned back by resistance led by the French Communist Party. And it's the French Communist Party that thus becomes the biggest part of the resistance movement. De Gaulle, the reason why he comes to prominence is because he's the most senior ranked official to not actually go directly over to fascism, and he was the only one in the war period who actually showed any energy or vision for defending the country. To give credit where credit is due, and he flees to England, to perfidious Albion, and is set up as the leader of Free France precisely because, well, he's the only guy left. All the rest of them have either capitulated or been captured, or completely discredited. So he's like the one bourgeois leader who the British and the Americans, or starting with the British, could elevate to national leadership status, because the only other game in town was the communists. So again, part of the history of World War II that we're generally not told about, not talked about, but Daryl Cooper's certainly not going to talk about that. So I've only really scratched to the surface here, but as Edward in the comments asked a question about the Baltic compradors, the idea that the Baltic states were under dual occupations, the Nazis and the communists. The Baltic states joined the Soviet Union at the request of Popular Front governments that were elected following mass movements of the working class against comprador and collaborationist regimes that wanted to openly collaborate with the Nazis. So it was movements of the working class in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia that pushed out these collaborators and requested entry into the USSR as constituent republics, which is what Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia always were in the USSR. They were constituent republics. They weren't absorbed into Russia. They were treated as Soviet republics. So they right up to the end. So what's the complaint from the bourgeoisie in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia is that they were thrown out of power for a few years. These were people, by the way, whose predecessors had been willing to turn the whole country over to the Nazis and act as compradors and temporary and rulers of the country for the Nazis to provide the staff to make up the Baltic SS divisions. So these ultra-reactionaries in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were more than willing to sell their own people into slavery, to see their own nations crushed, to see many, many hundreds of thousands of people murdered, the Jewish population amongst them, in the Baltic states, in return for getting a pat on the head every now and again from German imperialism. That's the nature of the people that run the Baltic states. They were willing to sell their countries into semi-slavery in the 1930s. They were willing to act as Hitler's willing executioners in the 1940s, and now they act as the agents for American imperialism, destroying the nations they keep babbling on about how much they love them, but destroying all the national culture, all the elements, important elements of the nation that was protected in the period of the USSR, however imperfect that might have been. All of this is now being destroyed by US imperialism and its influence. So these arseholes in the Baltic states and elsewhere who complain and whinge about occupation, what they really meant was that there was a class war in their country, and at that time they lost, and they got pushed out. And they got pushed out after the war, which, by the way, after the war, the bourgeoisie in exile continued to aid and assist terrorist campaigns waged against the Latvian, Estonian, Lithuanian working class when they were trying to rebuild after the war. The pro-Nazi underground in those countries remained strong and aided directly by the CIA and MI6 for years afterwards. So we're in the comments now, by the way, and thanks to all 445 of you who are watching. So what I've done there in the past hour is I have talked about some areas that we should question the conventional bourgeois narrative over World War II. I haven't even got to like most of or the even bigger problems which would confront us immediately after World War II. But those are some of the things that I think are worthy of talking about. Okay, so let's do some greetings. Hello to Edward, joining us from the Baltic lands. Hello to Svetlana, joining us from Moscow. Davy in Gwynedd. Grassy Knoll. Tim Gray. Peter from Perfidious Albion. More time needed from Skeggy, Britain. Grassy Knoll is just reading about Winston Churchill and the Battle of Gallipoli. Yes, where Churchill revealed himself to be a complete military incompetent. Hello to Georgina in the chat, and hello to Tom Jode and Lee. Matthew Newbury says Munich 1938 needs to be examined, I think. Well, a lot of things from that period need to be examined. But yes, more research needed, certainly. Jawad, greetings to you, my comrade in Dorset. And T.G. Wilson is here, as is VLX11387. Luca, good evening to you. Robeson, good morning to you out there in Indonesia. Good evening to Irish Partisan, our comrade in a warm and balmy Minsk. The exact opposite of what we've got here. Dr. Fu Manchu is here, as is Rob and Beans over there on the wrong side of the Pennines, as is Zane. Hello to Harold as well, and Jerry. And hello to D.E. And Paul Mason is here, who's liking the acerbic wit, especially when it isn't directed at me. Paul, you're welcome on the show anytime. Come on. Let's talk about your book on fascism. That was a fun read. Spurious Furious, hello to you. David King, hello to you. Jenny, good afternoon to you. And let's scroll through, see where we are. We also have Otis, BWP, and James Goblin, who says, good evening from Belgrade, Yugoslavia, the once and future Yugoslavia. Remember what Lenin wrote in State and Revolution, liking and sharing is praxis and caring. Direct quote from Lenin there. VLX says, it may as well be a Marvel movie the way it's presented nowadays. Indeed. T.G. Wilson says, 21st November 1945, Robert H. Jackson, the American chief prosecutor, to pass these defendants of poisoned chalices, to put it to our lips as well. Good point. Beaver and Hastings are pure imperial propagandists, says Zane. That's true. Good evening to Comrade Ian Foster. As said, like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Edward, I've seen your question on the Winter War. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to that on the in the series on World War II. By the way, this is the start of our series on World War II. Welcome along. Okay, T.G. Wilson, I've seen your comment about the X link to YouTube doesn't go to here anymore. Okay, I'll check that out. Tim Gray says Simon Sharma isn't a historian, but a TV presenter who reads a script. His books are dreadful and poorly researched. He cosplays being a victim whilst cheering on a genocide. Makes him an ideal historian for the British ruling class. But I see what you mean, Tim. David King says Saddam used by the West to fight Iran and then removed. Good point. Irish Partisan says, I have seen materials promoted by liberals on the far right that equates Nazi Germany to the USSR, National Socialism, Soviet Communism. They lump in the IRA, PLO, Sandinistas and Viet Cong with Hitler. Well, I've also seen Trotskyites argue that as well. So, but then again, they are liberals. Well, the funny thing about the far right is, I mean, in a way, I mean, Daryl Cooper's much more honest in that he actually is a fascist. So I prefer it now that they're coming out of the woodwork and giving themselves their proper titles. T.G. Wilson says, good time to remind everyone that NATO was a project Heinrich Himmler of the SS was very passionate about. Would explain the high number of Nazis who took top positions in it later. Indeed. And the fact that there's always been a trend in the hierarchy of the British and the American military who idolized Nazi commanders and Nazi tactics. Just going through the comments. I can't get all of them. Martin Milojevic says, Hitler was put in power to destroy the communist movement. He even sold out his own in order to the establishment, true to the establishment, he'll play ball with them, nice little long knives. Yes, the left Nazis. Come to them as we go through the series, I think. The Saxe-Coburg Gophers on the British throne loved the Austrian watercolour artist. Yeah, inspired by David King's comment that's there. Svetlana asks, with regard to Hitler being funded by aristocrats, what is your opinion of US bank funding of the Bolsheviks? Is that indeed true? It isn't true. I mean, that theory's been kicked around by various fascists, by various anti-communists inside the USA and inside Russia itself. Like, there's never been any evidence of it. I mean, the accusations from the Russian anti-communists is that, the Russian Revolution was funded by Jews, it was funded by bankers from Germany, it was funded by the British. Quite why the British had funded it, I don't know. The idea that the Bolsheviks were funded by Wall Street, it doesn't make any sense, and there's never been any evidence of it, never any real evidence of it. So, so I would just leave it at that. Like, it's something which has been asserted over and over again by various reactionaries, but they've never been able to prove it. Now, there is another more subtle argument from anarchists that the Bolsheviks used got advice from and some investment from American industrialists in the early 1920s, as part of the new economic policy. I mean, that was, if that's the argument that some people are still making, I would say, well, look at what those temporary concessions in the form of the NEP achieved. It got exactly the result that was required, which was got the Soviet Union on the track to a mass industrialization. And so any temporary retreat was more than justified by the results that were gained in terms of the power it brought ultimately to the Soviet working class. Zain Mudassir says Kamala is openly running on building Mexican-US border wall. Well, she'll build about as much of it as Trump did, which is nothing. It's always the same. There was no greater militarizer of the border than Bill Clinton. T.G. Wilson says Rofa Linton Orman founded British fascism in 1923, an insane reactionary who considered Oswald Mosley a communist. Yeah, there will be those. There will be those who, for whom Oswald Mosley was a sellout. Zane says Russia is still a prize for Western imperialism with vast land and resources. That's true. David King says 1895 Britain was making banks selling opium. Still is, I think. Bruce Wayne says Tyson and Krupp were big parts of German fascism. They merged post-World War and their vans can be seen around London. Weird seeing them knowing their history. Indeed, they never got broken up. Edward asks, Michael Hudson says that German banking pre-World War I was moving towards socialism naturally, and that British and US ruined that natural movement towards progress. My thoughts on that. Yes, Michael Hudson on that is completely and utterly wrong. That's why Hudson rejects Lenin, because Hudson makes this erroneous and completely unproven argument that capitalism was naturally developing towards socialism. I mean, the reason why he has to reject Lenin is that Lenin uses all kinds of examples from Germany about how Germany is accelerating towards the very same imperialism as the British are involved in, and that German banking or German finance capital had already emerged by the 1890s, which is, of course, the merger of money and banking capital to make finance capital. Was money and industrial capital to make finance capital. And Lenin goes through in exhaustive detail the way that that's happened with the German trusts. And so the idea that they were moving towards socialism, I mean, that puts Hudson on the same level as like the right wing of German social democracy in like the early 1900s. It's a nonsense idea. I know that Hudson's work is admired by some, but you can get a lot out of his economic histories. I find them interesting myself. I find him as a historian of the usages of debt, he's very interesting. When it comes to his analysis of political events, though, he gives away the fact that not only does he come out of the Trotskyite tradition, but ultimately because he's an anti-communist, and he is an anti-communist, it leads him into taking all kinds of weird and very stupid positions. I mean, Hudson's work completely neglects the observations made by Marx in Capital Volume 2 with regard to the natural tendency of capital to go towards, of the capitalists to want to get to a position where they're no longer engaged in commodity production, where they've moved from money, commodity to money, to just money, to cut out the commodity production aspect altogether. And that these manias would seize capitalism from time to time, and already had by the time that Marx wrote that in the 1860s and 70s. Hudson ignores all of that. Hudson has to ignore huge amounts of Marx, and that's why he slanders and then ignores Lenin, depending upon which point he wants to prove, in order to make this reach this bizarre conclusion. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It is not borne out by the history of German banking. And I know the argument that he's making, that the German banks were all about facilitating industry. Well, Lenin comprehensively proves that by the late 19th century that was no longer the case, that they were going down roughly the same path as the British. This is why they were involved in inter-imperialist competition with the British. They were competing for colonies in order to find more areas to export capital to. Like, this is stuff that is proven. So Hudson's conclusion is nonsense, which is why, like, again, his historical work on debt and things like that, even like the book, his book on imperialism, his own theory of imperialism. I don't agree with the theory, but there's a lot of interesting historical details in there. But when it comes to politics, the man's clueless. completely clueless, and basically feeds people who read him a lot of nonsense, to be completely blunt about it. Going through, Bruce Wayne says Deutsche Bank raised funds for concentration camps, I think, kind of like HSBC were behind the East India Company opium trade. Yeah. T.G. Wilson points out the opium trade has dropped off since the US withdrew from Afghanistan, almost as if they were behind it, almost as if the opiates problem, which, you know, Carlson and the ultra reactionaries are blaming on the Mexicans and the Chinese, was the creation of US imperialism itself. Svetlana asks, what English language history of World War II would you recommend, if any? I wouldn't. I'll take your question away, Svetlana. I mean, like, if you want to read, I mean, there's loads of English language histories of World War II. Most of them are garbage. Those that come from bourgeois academics are garbage. I'm trying to think of one that's any good. You know what? I can't actually think of any. I mean, most of them are crap. Most of them deliver a Marvel movie version of the history. There's individual histories of specific military events which can be quite interesting, like histories of the campaigns in World War II can be quite interesting, but most of the stuff, the general historical stuff about World War II in the English language, is guff. I will take your question away, though, because there must be something that we could recommend on it. So I'll have a look at it. Zain Mudassir says the Japanese also learned from European colonialism in their empire from Korea to Indonesia. Indeed. Unused Sub says the Second World War began in Spain. Hitler used the Spanish Civil War as a warm-up. Yes, as did the British. Going down through the comments here. Hello to Krasovets, who's got here late. You've probably missed quite a bit. Zain Mudassir says it's like the Liberals today saying killing people with drones is less bad. Yeah, they've always got an argument about why their particular method of murdering people is all right. Film recommendation from Irish Partisan, who says, speaking of the Taliban, the Italian war in Libya, you should check out The Lion of the Desert, starring Oliver Reed, Anthony Quinn, and Rod Steiger. Yes, I've heard of that one. I'll have to check it out. Oliver Reed is one of my favourite actors, despite the fact the man was an appalling reactionary. But there you go. Jawad asks, why is Gandhi so popular in the West? Because Gandhi collaborated with British imperialism, and Gandhi's like not so-called non-violence is something which the imperialists love to talk about. If you're going to resist us, you've got to do it non-violently. I would recommend the book by Harpal Brar on Indian independence called Inkilab Zindabad, which is a very good history of the true struggle of the Indian independence movement, not the Gandhi and the most limp bits of the Indian bourgeois who came to represent it in the end. Jawad says, my grand-uncle was involved in the independence efforts in Kashmir. He wrote that during World War II, even getting certain clothing and cotton and such was hard because of the British World War II collectivization. Yeah, the Brits continued exporting everything from India in World War II, even, of course, when the people were starving. Bruce Wayne says, some think Churchill won the war by himself from a bunker underneath Whitehall. Yeah, well, some people have got too many Churchill tattoos, and by the way, one is too many. Norman Shelley, a British actor, recorded the voice for many of Churchill's speeches. Interesting. So was it the T.G. Wilson's comment there? T.G. Wilson, can you confirm if it was the actor who was doing a lot of the most famous ones? That would be interesting if he was. Going down. Good evening to Stig Pedersen in Copenhagen. Okay. Decadent French elite was happy to work with Hitler, says Zane. Exactly. So, okay. Now, 504 of you watching. Well, good to have you all with us. So I'll just conclude by making a bit of an announcement. Sunday is, I'm aiming to have the Sunday as the day for the Marxist History of World War II series. Now, I was going to do this exclusively on Patreon, but I've decided that it's too important a series, given the likes of Cooper babbling on, to keep behind a paywall. So this series is going to be just on the main channel. I may need to pre-record some of the segments of this because it's going to take an awful lot of research. I mean, my aim in doing all of these live streams, doing this recording, is to make this an educational project. So I will find other things to do for the Patreon content if you're supporting the program on there. But I don't want to keep the really educational material behind a paywall. I don't think that's positive. That's not a good thing to do if you're engaged in an educational project. So if you want to support the program, please do so. But I'm not going to restrict the content to those which is valuable to those who can afford to pay. It's too important to put the critical analysis out there from a Marxist-Leninist perspective about World War II and not leave that critical analysis to the made-up fascist stories of Daryl Cooper and Tucker Carlson and Douglas McGregor and people like that. So thank you to all of you who do support the program on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be doing more, probably doing more film reviews on there in the near future. I'll be back again with you tomorrow talking about Stalin, always a good one. And I'll be then the next day talking about the war of resistance in West Asia against US imperialism. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. There's 510 of you here. I'll be back again with you tomorrow. Till then, thank you for watching and good evening to you all.